Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone is doing well. Just kidding, I hope you're all suffering. It's about time I finally review the hero from the latest Kingdom Rush Vengeance update, Jack-O-Lantern.
I will bury them!
However, before getting to that, I would like to thank our sponsor, Kingdom Defense. Do you like towers? Do you like units? Do you like enemies? Do you like God? Do you like use special upgrade to more powerful? If so, then Kingdom Defense is the game for you. Just search for Kingdom Rush in the App Store, scroll down a couple of lines, and you'll find Kingdom Defense. Speaking of things that are reminiscent of Kingdom Rush, Jack is a callback to the special enemy found in Kingdom Rush Frontiers, Jack-O-Lantern. In that game, he would teleport around the Desecrated Grove level, summoning enemies and throwing his explosive pumpkin head. Dealing enough damage would repel him and grant the player bonus gold, but it never truly killed him, as he would still spawn in the same fixed locations. Although this hero is the same character, the Vengeance iteration of Jack has a few differences, primarily his voice. In Kingdom Rush Frontiers, Jack sounds like this. Meanwhile, in Kingdom Rush Vengeance, Jack sounds like this.
I will bury them! Lose your head! It's hunting season!
You may also notice that the original Jack uses a sword. Meanwhile, the new Jack uses an axe. The enemies Jack summons in Frontiers include zombies and ghouls. In Vengeance, Jack only summons ghouls, who sprout from pumpkins and wear pumpkin hats. These are all relatively minor changes from the original. However, I think that they're worth exploring. From conversations with the game developers at Untitled Studios, not everyone wanted these changes, so it's worth discussing them in hindsight to see what would have been best. So let's begin with part 1, Jack's voice. Personally, I prefer the original. Both voices convey Jack's fun-loving attitude, but only the Frontiers voice manages to be cool as well. If he said the same lines but with his original voice, they would sound even better. Each of Jack's weapon options makes sense in their own way. Swords are balanced, neutral weapons, which is why main characters tend to use them the most. Weapons like axes tend to be used by side characters. In this sense, a sword is more fitting for Jack, since he is the main star of the level he appears in. However, axes are also associated with beheadings, which is very fitting for Jack, who is a headless horseman. I think that the axe is the better weapon. The best case would have been Jack having the axe since the beginning. I never would have thought that an axe would be better for Jack until I saw him use it in Vengeance. Now that he does, it makes more sense. But the change that doesn't make as much sense to me is what happened to Jack's summoned ghouls. The pumpkin accessories were added because they seemed cute. While there is nothing wrong with wanting to make cute designs, the ghouls in Frontiers were already designed to be cute. As a result, these additions are redundant. They take away from the nice balance of evil and cute by overemphasizing the cuteness. Now they just look silly. Changing Jack at all runs the risk of disappointing fans who wanted to use the same Jack that they saw in Frontiers. In order for the risk to pay off, the changes would have to be better than the original. But when the original is so good, there isn't much room for improvement. The context of a review showcases how little some changes actually improve a hero. It's far more exciting to say, we get to see the same Jack that we saw in Frontiers, than it is to say, we get to see Jack, but now he has an axe instead of a sword. Therefore, if Ironhide ever transitions other characters into newer games, it would be best to keep them as close to the originals as possible. The only changes that should be made are those that are necessary to make them fit into the new game. This makes it okay to give Jack new abilities to fill all of his upgrade slots. But making changes to things that would have transitioned perfectly fine into the new game should be avoided. That's why I take issue with his ghouls. Jack's voice is a trickier matter, because it is possible that the original voice actor wasn't available to reprise his role. So I don't think this is as worthy of criticism as other changes. However, it doesn't change the fact that having the original voice would have been better. Let me know in the comments what you think of each change, because I'm curious about the overall public opinion. But these are all subjective matters. I prefer more objective information, which brings me to part 2, Jack's stats. Jack has 400 HP, regenerates 42 health every 2 seconds, deals 50 to 90 physical damage, takes 2 seconds between attacks, has 41% armor, yes, 41% exactly, has an 18-second respawn time, and has fast movement speed. These are all the stats when every soul point upgrade is enabled for heroes. Without these upgrades, Jack has 333 HP, which is close to the amount of health that he has in Frontiers on casual difficulty. I like to imagine that enabling casual difficulty for one side is equivalent to disabling the upgrades for the other side. I would like to see more uses of mechanics like this that add another layer of meaning to features seen throughout the series. From Jack's stats, you can already tell that he is suited for dealing high damage to enemies, but cannot withstand much damage himself. He also takes a long time to attack, and the cooldown for his attack cannot be reset by moving him. Despite dealing 50 to 90 damage, he can overkill enemies, and his 2-second attack speed makes him take a while to move on to the next target. Coupled with his low health, his basic combat abilities are actually not that reliable. However, he makes up for this by having very useful abilities. Part 3. Jack's abilities. Jack's innate skill is Ghost Rider.
It's hunting season. Don't lose your head.
When ordered to move, Jack will normally ride his horse to the chosen location. However, with this innate, he will teleport to the chosen location if he is far enough away. The distance he needs to move in order for the teleport to trigger is more than a quarter of the length of the entire map. This can make Jack hard to control, because he would not teleport if the player needs to nudge him around the enemies in a small area. So, all the time spent galloping on his horse to a location is wasted, because he could have teleported instead. Thankfully, there are ways to circumvent this. A common technique for all heroes who teleport is to move them as far away as possible. This guarantees that they will teleport when you order them to move to the desired location. This isn't as effective when using Jack for 2 reasons. The first is that he moves fast enough to match the speed of 2 teleports anyways. The second reason is that Jack has some abilities that he can accidentally waste while he is teleported to the corner of the map. One of these is Exploding Head, which has a short cooldown and thus isn't that big of a deal. But the ghouls that Jack can spawn are a much heavier loss if they get wasted. The best solution that I've devised is to move Jack slightly too far from where you actually want him to go. Moving him far enough will force a teleport, then you can inch him to his desired location. This is always faster than teleporting twice, assuming you don't move him very far from the final destination. In this diagram, the outer circle represents the furthest distance that Jack can move before he uses his teleport. It is still faster to move normally as long as the destination is within the circle with the blue radius, which is 3/4 of the maximum range Jack can travel before teleporting. But don't worry too much about optimizing travel speed. Jack is fast no matter what. The real reason to force his teleportation is that Jack has a tendency to engage in melee combat before executing his abilities. This doesn't always happen, as I do have footage of Jack using abilities before entering melee combat. But I also have footage of the inverse happening. So, forcing Jack to teleport is meant to guarantee that he uses his abilities, which are the most important for his effectiveness. Speaking of activated abilities, Jack's first upgradable power is Explosive Head.
This headache is killing me. This headache is.
Jack throws his pumpkin head at a specific enemy, which deals 115 damage thanks to the soul point upgrade that improves hero damage by 15%. Just like artillery attacks, Jack's head is aimed at a specific enemy even though it has an area of effect. Thankfully, the AoE is large enough that it hits multiple enemies reliably. Also, like artillery, the attack ignores half of all armor. This even applies to enemies who are immune to physical damage, like ghosts. Jack uses this ability all the time because of its 4-second cooldown. In fact, it recharges so fast that it's basically his form of a consistent ranged attack. Therefore, it is essential to know how to use this ability optimally in order to get the most out of Jack. Jack prioritizes hitting bosses with this ability over any other enemy. So, a good way to deal more damage is to block enemies with reinforcements as soon as they pass the boss. When there are no bosses in range, Jack's priority is the next strongest target. The game has a hierarchy of enemies in its code to decide who the strongest enemy is. Generally, the bigger the enemy is, the higher its threat level. When faced with multiple of the same enemy, Jack aims at the one with the lowest health. So, it is best to group up enemies around the one with low health in order to get all of them caught in the explosion, just like the tactic for bosses. Flying enemies are tricky for Jack to kill, since he can't attack enemies flying directly above him. So you have to keep inching him forward or backward to be in a position to aim properly. This can be annoying because moving Jack right before he throws his head causes the cooldown to reset. Those 4 seconds can be valuable against enemies who aren't able to be hit by normal attacks. Frozen souls are an especially bad case. Because they have a low threat level, Jack will not aim at them unless they are the only enemy in range. So do not try to use Jack to finish them off unless they are completely isolated. This skill is especially effective against ranged enemies. By placing units in range for the enemy in front to shoot at, the other ranged enemies can catch up and start shooting too. Once they're all grouped together, Jack's head will make quick work of all of them. When fighting basic enemies, it is important to move Jack in and out of melee range so that he can use explosive head. It does better damage than his basic attack in nearly all situations. And since each melee attack takes 2 seconds, you can fit 2 melee attacks between each ranged attack to maximize his damage output. It's also fine to leave Jack behind your other troops while he just throws pumpkins. There are many cases in which it would simply be too dangerous to let him take damage, so keeping him safe behind troops is the best approach. This is by far Jack's definitive ability. The majority of his playstyle is centered around getting the most optimal explosion damage with this attack. In many ways, it is the opposite of Jack's next ability, Haunted Blade. Every 4 seconds, Jack executes a melee attack that deals magic damage and permanently removes the magic resistance of his target. More often than not, this ability significantly lowers Jack's damage output. This is because the magic damage is affected by the enemy's magic resistance before it gets removed. As a result, it practically deals no damage at all. When tested in emergency situations, Jack is much less effective when he has this ability upgraded. This is because Explosive Head is so good at killing hordes of enemies, and the majority of enemies with magic resistance come in swarms anyways. I'm going to purposefully leave the ability unupgraded to show how much more effective Jack is without it. Granted, his use of the ability is separate from the cooldown of his normal attack. However, since he uses Haunted Blade upon first engagement with an enemy, this is only a benefit when it recharges in the middle of combat, and even then only slightly. Here you can see an example of an enemy who will die in one more attack, but if Haunted Blade was upgraded, it would have received the attack damage and still survived for yet another attack. Haunted Blade deals 50 to 90 damage, just like Jack's normal attack, but as magic damage. Think about how many enemies have a low enough magic resistance to actually take significant damage from this attack. Of those enemies with low magic resistance, how many of them have high enough health to actually be worth debuffing instead of just killing them right away with Explosive Head and a melee attack? Of course, there will be some moments during a level when this ability is useful, but I do find it to do more harm than good to Jack's usefulness throughout the course of an entire stage. Jack has an alternative way of dealing with tougher enemies anyways, and that's his next ability, Spirit of Vengeance. 60% of the damage dealt to Jack is added to his next melee attack. Jack's armor is factored in before calculating how much damage he receives. So if an enemy deals 200 damage, Jack will receive 118 damage because of his 41% armor. Then he will gain 70.8 damage, which always rounds down to 70. Now Jack's next melee attack would deal 120 to 160 physical damage. There are many footnotes that come with this ability. For one, this only applies to Jack's basic attack, so Explosive Head and Haunted Blade are unaffected. Additionally, the ability only seems to stick as long as Jack stays in melee combat with the same enemy. Moving Jack causes him to lose the bonus damage when he attacks other enemies. Consequently, Jack can only steal damage from melee attacks. Area of effect and ranged attacks do nothing. Instant kills do not give him infinite damage when he respawns. A soul point upgrade that gives heroes a chance to take 0 damage from attacks will affect this ability. The same applies to other forms of invulnerability, causing Jack to gain no bonus damage. This is a helpful skill against enemies who deal a lot of damage, allowing Jack to dish out high damage against them as well. Because of his low health, there is only so much damage he can absorb. This encourages the player to move Jack near the strongest enemies to block them, and then retreat to use Explosive Head to clear out the weaker enemies while he heals. This is a passive ability, so it will trigger without needing a cooldown. Therefore, it is always useful to benefit from it because there is no possibility of wasting an activation of the ability. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Jack's next ability, Thriller.
Headache is killing me. I will bury them. Your head. Come here, I dare you. Come here, I dare you. Don't lose your head.
Thriller is the name of the ability that Jack uses to summon ghouls. Every 30 seconds, he spawns 4 ghouls around him that last for 20 seconds. No matter the upgrade level of the ability, or if you have every soul point upgrade as shown in this clip, their stats will be the same. And those stats are 320 HP, 15 to 25 physical melee damage, a 1-second attack speed, and 20% armor. I've criticized this ability a lot for its changes to the original ghouls, but I have to criticize it some more for how it functions in gameplay. Once the 30-second cooldown is complete, Jack uses the ability the first chance that he gets, even if there are no enemies in range. This is a curse and a blessing, because these ghouls can be easily wasted if Jack is not in a good position every 30 seconds. But it can also be used to plant ghouls in a specific spot where enemies will be spawning soon. While Jack's quickly charging exploding head and teleport abilities make him a very reactionary hero, this ability adds the need to be much more deliberate in your usage of Jack, to the point where every 30 seconds need to be planned out in order to optimize him. One way to make this ability easier to keep track of is to use reinforcements as soon as he spawns ghouls. Because of the 14-second cooldown, you can use reinforcements twice and nearly line it up with the cooldown of Thriller. That way, when reinforcements are almost done charging, you know that the ghouls are ready to be spawned as well. Of course, calling waves early will mess up the timing again. So can enemies fighting Jack in melee combat. Since Jack doesn't use abilities while blocking enemies, this is the only way to save up the skill without moving Jack around, which would run the risk of wasting it. However, blocking enemies means that Jack can't use Explosive Head either. And since Thriller takes priority over any other abilities, it is not possible to quickly move Jack out of melee combat to use Explosive Head and still save up the ghouls. This is my main criticism of the skill from a gameplay perspective. Since Exploding Head has such a short cooldown, it would be much better to use that ability, then use Thriller, and be that much closer to using Exploding Head again after that animation. But as it is, the ability stands to get wasted every time you move Jack around to try to heal him or use Explosive Head. Still, this is a really helpful ability. When enemies are close to leaking, ghouls can hold down the fort and group enemies up so that Jack can use Explosive Head to greater effect. Ghouls have a combined HP of 1280, plus their 20% armor, making them effective blockers against even giant enemies as long as they don't have AoE attacks. This can sometimes make up for Jack's rather low health and armor. Coupled with reinforcements, Jack can hold down an entire lane thanks to this ability against the right enemies. But ranged enemies will completely wipe out the ghouls because they are stationary and only have melee attacks. Jack's hero spell is Nightmare.
Let's crack some lose your head. No rest for the I will bury them.
A stampede of haunted horses run down the path for about 5 seconds, causing enemies to move in the opposite direction down the path for as long as the horses are touching them. This ability deals less than half of the damage that it says in the description. It's a severe overestimation. The spell's only real use is being able to move enemies backwards down the path. It has no effect on ghosts, bosses, or anything else with the immunity tag. It also has no effect on enemies who are stunned or otherwise immobilized, as they will not be able to move down the path. This includes enemies who are locked in an animation, such as an attack or ability of their own. A common example of this would be the elven archers who are too busy firing arrows to acknowledge the fact that they have the fear affliction. The fear effect is only as powerful as the enemy's speed. If enemies are as fast as the horses, they will stay in range the entire time and take the maximum amount of damage. Anything slower than the horses will get left behind. Anything faster than the horses may break free and start moving normally again, but they will likely get hit a second time, so slow enemies are the ones who are least affected by this skill. One of the most effective ways to use this ability is by pushing an enemy into the range of a tower with a powerful skill like Possession or any insta-kill. Again, this is easier to do for a faster enemy. Some slow enemies may not even make it into the range of the tower. Another technique is to spawn the horses far enough away that they only reach a fraction of the enemies in a lane, causing them to be clumped together. However, the distance traveled by the horses can make this rather difficult, because you may end up hitting every enemy anyways, at which point the distance between each of them is unchanged. Since the horses travel along a path, this is another one of those abilities that needs to be positioned carefully so that it does not travel down the wrong path and get wasted. Waste is a common theme in a lot of Jack's skills. Haunted Blade wastes time by decreasing Jack's damage output. Jack's ghouls can get wasted when he is in the wrong position at the wrong time, and Nightmare can waste itself by going the wrong way. Even the act of moving Jack can waste time if he isn't ordered far enough away to bother using his teleport. Players have to put as much into planning their tactics to kill every Jack spawn in Frontiers as they would into getting the most out of Jack's abilities in Vengeance. An intentional design. While Jack isn't perfect to me, these issues only come up because I am taking a critical, in-depth look at him as a hero. But in the end, he's still fun to play with, and offers some pretty rewarding combat potential when used intelligently. So if you're not intelligent, don't get this hero. You buffoon.